The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport's exclusive private terminal. Sarah Johnson's sleek black Tesla Model S pulled up to the entrance at precisely 7:30 a.m., right on schedule as always. The 35-year-old tech CEO had built her entire career on being punctual and prepared, and today was no different. As she stepped out of her car, Sarah adjusted her simple black blazer, not a designer label, but well-tailored and professional. Her natural hair was styled neatly, and she carried a leather laptop bag that had seen better days but remained her lucky charm through countless business deals. The valet approached with a warm smile, having seen her numerous times before at this terminal. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson," he said, taking her car keys. "Another busy day ahead." Sarah nodded with a gentle smile. Her mind was already focused on the investor meeting in San Francisco. Her software company, DataSmart Solutions, was on the verge of closing a $50 million funding round. It had been a long journey from coding in her garage 6 years ago to becoming one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. The morning air was crisp, and the usual buzz of private jets taking off filled the background. Sarah checked her phone. 3 new emails from her executive team and a text from her mother asking about Sunday dinner. She smiled at her mom's message, remembering how far she'd come from their small apartment in South Central LA, where her mother had raised her alone while working 2 jobs. Walking toward the terminal entrance, Sarah observed the usual morning crowd. A famous actor she recognized from movies was arguing with his agent near the door. 2 older men in expensive suits were discussing golf scores, and a family with 3 kids was loading their designer luggage onto a cart. Just another typical morning at the private terminal, where wealth and influence intersected daily. Sarah had been using private jets for the past 2 years, not out of luxury, but necessity. Her company's rapid expansion meant she often needed to visit multiple cities in a single day. Commercial flights couldn't keep up with her schedule, and time had become her most valuable asset. Today's flight would take her to San Francisco for the investor meeting, then to Seattle for a client presentation, and back to LA by dinner time. As she walked, Sarah mentally rehearsed her presentation. DataSmart's new artificial intelligence platform had shown promising results in early tests, helping small businesses reduce their energy consumption by 40%. It wasn't just about making money anymore. Her company was making a real difference in fighting climate change. The security guard stationed at the entrance was new. She hadn't seen him before. Sarah reached for her credentials, a routine she had performed hundreds of times. Her regular flight crew was already expecting her. Captain Martinez had texted earlier to confirm they were ready for the 8 a.m. departure. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Her assistant, Jenny, had sent over the final changes to the investor presentation. The new graphics looked perfect, showcasing their impressive growth over the past quarter. The company had grown from 5 employees to 500 in just 6 years, and their client list included some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley. Looking up at the clear blue California sky, Sarah took a deep breath. Days like these reminded her of how surreal her journey felt sometimes. Just 10 years ago, she was working as a junior programmer, sharing a tiny apartment with 2 roommates. Now, she employed hundreds of people and was about to close one of the biggest deals in her company's history. The morning sun highlighted the row of private jets lined up on the tarmac. Sarah could see her company's chartered jet, not branded or flashy, just practical and efficient, like everything else in her business. Captain Martinez and his crew had been flying her for the past year, becoming almost like family. They understood her schedule, her preference for green tea over coffee, and how she liked to use flight time to prepare for meetings. As Sarah approached the terminal entrance, she felt confident and prepared, just as she had trained herself to be through years of fighting her way up in the tech world. What she didn't know was that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary, and her next interaction would spark a chain of events that would reach far beyond her personal journey. The glass doors of the terminal gleamed in the morning sun, and Sarah reached for her ID badge, ready for another routine check-in. But sometimes life has other plans, even for those who plan everything perfectly. Derek Matthews stood at his post, hands clasped behind his back, watching the morning crowd with what he thought was a professional eye. 6 months into his job as a security guard at the private terminal, he had developed what he considered a sixth sense about who belonged there. He prided himself on keeping the exclusive terminal free from unauthorized persons. As Sarah approached the glass doors, Matthews quickly stepped forward, positioning himself directly in her path. His hand raised in a stopping motion, and his face wore an expression that was more than just professional doubt, it was dismissive. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, emphasizing the word ma'am in a way that made it sound less than respectful. "This is a private aviation terminal. The main passenger terminal is that way." He pointed toward the regular airport entrance about half a mile down the road. Sarah remained calm, having faced similar situations before in her career. "I understand that," she replied evenly, reaching for her credentials. "I'm here for my scheduled flight. I have all my documentation right here." Matthews didn't even glance at the ID she was trying to show him. Instead, he crossed his arms and shifted his weight, creating an even more solid barrier. "Ma'am, this area is for private jet passengers only. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Behind them, a group of executives walked past, nodding to Matthews as they entered without any scrutiny. Sarah noticed this but kept her voice steady. "Sir, I'm a private jet passenger. If you'll just look at my credentials." "Listen," Matthews cut her off, his voice growing louder. "I've been doing this job long enough to know who belongs here and who doesn't. Now, you can either head to the main terminal willingly, or I'll have to call for backup." Several other passengers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Among them was Richard Chen, a regular client who recognized Sarah from several tech conferences. He frowned as he observed the situation but hesitated to intervene, unsure if he should get involved. Sarah took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to call my flight coordinator right now. Captain Martinez and his crew are expecting me for an 8 a.m. departure." She maintained eye contact with Matthews as she dialed, her fingers steady despite the frustration building inside her. Matthews scoffed. "Oh, now you have a private pilot too. Ma'am, making up stories isn't going to help your situation. In fact," he reached for his radio, "I'm going to have to report this as a security incident." Just then, Jenny, Sarah's assistant, came running from the parking lot, carrying a folder of documents she'd forgotten to give Sarah earlier. "Ms. Johnson," she called out, "you forgot the updated investor presentations." Matthews glanced between Jenny and Sarah, his certainty wavering slightly, but he doubled down. "Both of you need to step away from the entrance. This is a restricted area." Sarah's phone connected to the flight coordinator. "Hi Tom, this is Sarah Johnson. I'm having some trouble accessing the terminal." "Yes, I'm at the usual entrance." "Yes, Captain Martinez is expecting me." Matthew's radio crackled to life with a response to his security alert. At the same time, the terminal manager, Alice Cooper, who had been alerted by other staff members about the commotion, hurried toward the entrance. The morning sun now felt uncomfortably warm on Matthew's neck as he watched more people gathering. A few had their phones out, recording the incident. He tugged at his collar, but his face remained set in stubborn determination. "Is there a problem here?" Alice asked, her voice carrying the weight of authority. She immediately recognized Sarah, having seen her pass through the terminal countless times before. Before anyone could answer, Captain Martinez himself appeared at the door. "Sarah, we were getting worried when you didn't come through for pre-flight check. Is everything okay?" The color drained from Matthew's face as he watched his assumptions crumble in real time. Sarah stood there, still composed, still professional, as the truth of her identity became clear to everyone watching. The morning breeze carried whispers from the growing crowd of onlookers. Matthew's hand dropped from his radio, and his shoulders slumped slightly as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. But this moment of realization was just the beginning of what would become a much larger lesson about prejudice, power, and the danger of assumptions. The tension in the air could be cut with a knife as Sarah calmly opened her leather laptop bag. She pulled out a folder containing her flight documentation, company ID, and pilot-approved passenger list. Her hands were steady, but inside, her heart was racing with a familiar feeling, one she had hoped wouldn't follow her even after all her success. "Here are my credentials," Sarah said, holding them out to Matthews. "You'll find everything in order, my flight plan, security clearance, and regular passenger status." Her voice remained professional, though a hint of wariness crept in. She'd been through similar situations before, but never at this terminal where she'd flown from dozens of times. Matthews took the documents with visible reluctance. His eyes darted across the papers, looking for any reason to justify his earlier behavior. The terminal manager, Alice Cooper, stepped closer, her face showing growing concern at the situation unfolding before her. "Sir," Alice started, "Ms. Johnson is one of our regular." "I need to verify these," Matthews interrupted, pulling out his phone. He began typing numbers into his system, his fingers pressing the screen with unnecessary force. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. Several phones were still recording, their cameras capturing every moment of the tense scene. Jenny, Sarah's assistant, stepped forward with additional documentation. "I also have copies of Ms. Johnson's flight arrangements for the entire week, including today's meetings in San Francisco and Seattle." She spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the now quiet terminal entrance. Captain Martinez, who had been watching with increasing frustration, checked his watch. "We're going to miss our departure window if this continues," he said firmly. "Ms. Johnson has a critical investor meeting in San Francisco at 10 a.m. Sarah nodded, then pulled out her phone again. "Let me call my company's legal team," she said, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. "They should be able to provide any additional verification you need." She began scrolling through her contacts, her finger hovering over her lawyer's name. Matthews' radio crackled again. "Control to Matthews, what's your status on that security check?" The voice sounded impatient. "Still verifying documentation," Matthews replied, his voice less confident now. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead despite the terminal's cool air conditioning. He looked up from the papers to see Richard Chen, the tech executive who had recognized Sarah earlier, approaching. "This is ridiculous," Richard said, shaking his head. "I've seen Ms. Johnson speak at 3 different tech conferences. She's the CEO of DataSmart Solutions. Their AI technology is revolutionizing energy efficiency in buildings across the country." Alice, the terminal manager, had finally had enough. "Matthews, I can personally vouch for Ms. Johnson. She flies through this terminal at least twice a week." Her voice carried the weight of authority that could no longer be ignored. More terminal staff had gathered nearby, many of them nodding in recognition of Sarah. The regular cleaning staff, security personnel, and check-in agents all knew her. She always greeted them by name and asked about their families. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her investor in San Francisco. "Looking forward to the 10 a.m. presentation. Big news to discuss." She showed the message to Captain Martinez, who shook his head in frustration. Matthews still held the documents, his hands now slightly shaking. The evidence of his mistake was becoming overwhelming, but something in him still refused to fully back down. "I still need to complete the security protocol," he insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier authority. Just then, a senior airport security supervisor, attracted by the commotion, strode through the terminal doors. Chief Williams, a veteran of 20 years in airport security, took in the scene with experienced eyes. "What's the situation here?" he asked, looking between Matthews and Sarah. Before anyone could answer, he spotted Sarah and his face brightened with recognition. "Ms. Johnson, I was just reading about your company's new green energy initiative in Tech Weekly. Is there a problem?" The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal's glass walls, illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. Matthews stood frozen, holding Sarah's documents, as the truth of his assumptions and their consequences became increasingly clear to everyone present. Sarah checked her watch. 20 minutes had passed since she arrived. 20 minutes of dignity challenged, of success questioned, of humanity diminished. But what happened next would transform this moment of prejudice into something unexpected. Something that would change not just one person's perspective, but an entire system's approach to equality and respect. Chief Williams took control of the situation with the calm efficiency of a veteran security professional. He gently took the documents from Matthews' trembling hands and glanced at them briefly, though he already knew what he would find. "Everything is in perfect order, as always, Ms. Johnson," he said, handing the papers back to Sarah. Then he turned to Matthews, his expression stern but controlled. "Officer Matthews, would you care to explain why one of our most frequent passengers is being delayed?" Matthews opened his mouth, then closed it again. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical force. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, with maintenance workers, other passengers, and terminal staff, all watching the scene unfold. I was just following security protocols," Matthews managed to say, but his voice lacked conviction. The excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. Sarah's phone buzzed again, another message from San Francisco. The investors were already gathering for the meeting. Captain Martinez stepped forward, his usual friendly demeanor replaced with professional urgency. "Ms. Johnson, if we leave right now, we can still make your meeting," he said. "The weather window is perfect, and we can make up some time in the air." He turned to Chief Williams. "With your permission, sir?" The chief nodded immediately. "Of course. Ms. Johnson, please proceed to your flight. We'll handle this situation." He gestured toward the terminal entrance, now finally clear of any obstacles. As Sarah moved to leave, Matthews suddenly found his voice again. "Ms. Johnson, he started, his face flushed with embarrassment and shame. The realization of who she was, and more importantly, who she had always been, hit him full force. The terminal's morning bustle had gone quiet. Everyone could hear Matthews' next words clearly. "I made assumptions. Terrible, unfair assumptions. I was—" He trailed off, looking at the ground. Sarah paused, turning back to face him. In that moment, she saw not just Matthews, but every person who had ever doubted her, questioned her presence, or assumed she didn't belong. She saw the security guards who had followed her in high-end stores, the receptionists who had assumed she was a delivery person rather than a CEO, the countless small moments of prejudice that had marked her journey. Just then, a group of executives rushed through the doors, late for their own flights. They nodded casually to Matthews and walked past without any scrutiny. The contrast was stark and obvious to everyone watching. Richard Chen, who had witnessed the entire scene, stepped forward. "You know, I've flown from this terminal for 5 years," he said to Matthews. "Not once have you asked to verify my credentials. Not once." Alice, the terminal manager, was already on her tablet, pulling up records. "Ms. Johnson has flown through this terminal 73 times in the past year alone. She sponsored 3 charity events for our airport's youth aviation program. Her company's software actually runs our terminal's energy management system." Each new revelation seemed to make Matthews shrink further into himself. The badge on his chest, which had given him such authority just moments ago, now felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Jenny approached Sarah with the investor presentations. "The San Francisco team just confirmed they'll wait for you. Your reputation precedes you. They said they'd delay the meeting rather than miss the opportunity." Sarah took a deep breath, looking around at the faces watching this moment unfold. She saw anger in some, sympathy in others, and recognition in many. But most importantly, she saw an opportunity, not for revenge, but for change. "Chief Williams," she said, her voice clear and professional, "I would like to schedule a meeting with airport administration when I return from San Francisco. Not to file a complaint, but to discuss how we might turn this incident into an opportunity for improvement." The chief nodded, understanding the significance of her response. Matthews looked up, surprised by the direction this was taking. He had expected anger, demands for his dismissal, or legal threats. Instead, he was witnessing something far more powerful, the quiet strength of someone who had faced these battles before and knew how to turn them into victories for everyone. Sarah checked her watch one final time. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the terminal's glass walls and illuminating the scene in bright, clear light. It was time to move forward, both literally to her waiting plane and figuratively toward whatever change this moment might bring. 2 days after the incident, Sarah sat in her office on the 30th floor of a downtown Los Angeles skyscraper. The wall of windows behind her desk showed the city sprawling out toward the ocean, but her attention was focused on the email on her screen. News of what happened at the terminal had spread quickly through social media, though Sarah herself hadn't posted anything about it. Jenny entered the office with a cup of green tea. "The airport administration called again," she said, placing the tea on Sarah's desk. "They want to know if you're still willing to meet with them tomorrow morning." Sarah nodded, taking a sip of the tea. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from news outlets wanting to hear her story. Several civil rights organizations had reached out, asking her to file formal complaints. But Sarah had a different plan in mind. "What time is the meeting?" Sarah asked, closing her laptop. 9 a.m., Jenny replied. "And Officer Matthews will be there too. The airport asked if that was okay with you." Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking about Matthews. Since the incident, she had received various opinions about how to handle the situation. Some people wanted her to demand his firing. Others suggested a lawsuit against the airport. But Sarah remembered something her mother had always told her. When you have the power to destroy or teach, choose to teach. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the airport administration building 15 minutes early. The conference room was already full. The airport director, 3 board members, Chief Williams, the head of HR, and in the corner, looking uncomfortable in a suit instead of his uniform, Officer Matthews. "Thank you all for meeting with me," Sarah began, her voice calm and clear. She opened her laptop and pulled up a presentation she had prepared. "I'm not here to demand anyone's termination or to file complaints. I'm here to propose a solution." The room was silent as Sarah clicked to the first slide. It showed statistics about bias incidents in various private airports across the country. "What happened to me isn't unique," she explained, "but our response to it can be." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah outlined her proposal. Her company, Data Smart Solutions, would work with the airport to develop a comprehensive training program. It would use virtual reality simulations to help security staff understand and recognize their unconscious biases. The program would include real-world scenarios and teach de-escalation techniques. "The goal isn't to shame anyone," Sarah said, looking directly at Matthews, who had barely moved since she started speaking. "The goal is to make everyone better at their jobs by helping them understand their own biases and overcome them." The airport director leaned forward, clearly interested. "Ms. Johnson, this is unexpected. Most people in your position would be asking for very different outcomes." Sarah smiled slightly. "Firing Officer Matthews won't solve the larger problem, but using this incident as a teaching moment might prevent hundreds of similar incidents in the future." Matthews finally spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. "Why? Why would you want to help after what I did?" Sarah turned to face him fully. "Because 10 years ago, when I was starting my company, someone gave me a chance to learn from my mistakes. They could have fired me when I messed up a major client presentation. Instead, they taught me how to do better. Sometimes, the best way to create change is to help people grow." The head of HR was already taking notes. "How soon could we implement this program?" "We could have a pilot version ready in 3 months," Sarah replied. "And I'd like Officer Matthews to be part of the development team. His perspective and experience would be valuable in creating realistic scenarios." Matthews looked up in surprise. The airport director and board members exchanged glances, clearly impressed by this unexpected approach. Chief Williams nodded approvingly. This could be a model for other airports to follow. As the meeting continued, Sarah noticed something change in Matthews' expression. The shame and defensiveness began to fade, replaced by something else, understanding, and perhaps even hope. This was why she had chosen this path. Sometimes, the best way to break down walls was not to crash through them, but to transform them into bridges. The morning sun streamed through the conference room windows, casting long shadows across the table. But unlike the shadows of bias and prejudice, these shadows were already beginning to fade, making way for a brighter, more inclusive future in an unexpected place. A week after the incident, Sarah sat in her home office, scrolling through her phone. The video of her confrontation with Matthews had gone viral, reaching millions of views across different social media platforms. But what caught her attention wasn't the incident itself, it was how people were responding to it. "Have you seen the comments?" Jenny asked during their morning video call. "Everyone's talking about how you handled it. The hashtag lead like Johnson is trending." Sarah switched to her laptop and opened Twitter. The video, originally posted by one of the terminal's passengers, had sparked an unexpected conversation. Instead of the usual angry calls for firing and boycotts, people were discussing better ways to handle bias in professional settings. A notification popped up on her screen, another news outlet requesting an interview. This would be the 20th request this week. So far, Sarah had declined them all, preferring to let her actions speak louder than words. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard Chen. "Just saw you're speaking at next month's Security Industry Conference. Count me in as a supporter. This is the change we need." Sarah opened her email to find a message from Matthews. Her cursor hovered over it for a moment before she clicked. "Ms. Johnson, I've been working with the training development team this week. Yesterday, I shared my story with them, the whole story. How I grew up in a small town with very little diversity. How I carried those limited perspectives into my job. How meeting you changed everything. The VR training scenarios we're developing feel real because they are real. They're based on my mistakes, my learning, my growth. Thank you for seeing potential for change where others might have only seen reason for punishment. Respectfully, Derek Matthews. Sarah smiled, remembering her mother's words about teaching rather than destroying. She began typing her response when Jenny interrupted through the video call. Sarah, you need to see this. Other airports are reaching out. They want to know more about the training program. Opening LinkedIn, Sarah found her inbox filled with messages from airport administrators across the country. The incident had sparked a larger conversation about security protocols and bias training in private aviation. A notification from Instagram caught her attention. Someone had shared a series of photos. The first showed Sarah being stopped at the terminal, and the second showed her leading yesterday's training development meeting, with Matthews actively participating. The caption read, "This is how real leaders handle discrimination. No drama, just solutions. Hashtag lead like Johnson." Sarah's assistant forwarded another email, this one from a major aviation industry magazine. They wanted to feature the training program in their next issue. The editor noted how this incident could become a case study in effective leadership and bias prevention. As she read through the messages, Sarah noticed something interesting. People weren't just talking about the incident anymore. They were discussing solutions. Security officers were sharing their own experiences with unconscious bias. Companies were asking about implementing similar training programs. Her phone rang. It was Chief Williams from the airport. "Ms. Johnson," he said when she answered, "I thought you'd like to know. 3 other major airports have contacted us about your training program. They want to implement it before it's even finished." Sarah walked to her window, looking out at the city. "That's great news, Chief. How's Officer Matthews doing with the development team?" "Actually, that's the other reason I'm calling," Williams replied. "His insights have been invaluable. He's speaking up in meetings, sharing his perspective. It's like watching someone transform in real time." After ending the call, Sarah opened Twitter one more time. Among the thousands of comments and shares, one stood out. A young black woman had posted, "Watching this story unfold gives me hope. Sometimes the biggest changes start with one person choosing education over anger. Hashtag lead like Johnson." Jenny's voice came through the video call again. "Sarah, should we release an official statement? Everyone wants to know your side of the story." Sarah thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No statement needed. The work we're doing speaks for itself. Real change doesn't need a press release." As the afternoon sun filled her office, Sarah returned to Matthew's email and finished her response. Sometimes, the most powerful messages weren't the ones that went viral on social media, but the quiet words exchanged between 2 people who had learned and grown from a moment that could have torn them apart, but instead brought them, and others, together. 3 months after the incident, the private terminal at LAX looked different, not in its physical appearance, but in the way people moved through it. Security staff greeted passengers with a new awareness, and the atmosphere felt more welcoming to everyone. In Training Room B, Matthews stood before a group of 20 security officers from different airports. He wore a navy blue suit instead of his uniform, and his badge now identified him as training coordinator rather than security officer. "Put on your VR headsets," he instructed the group. "Today's scenario is based on my own experience, a mistake that taught me more than any textbook could." The training program, developed by Sarah's company and the airport administration, was in its first month of implementation. The room hummed with the sound of participants responding to virtual scenarios, learning to recognize and overcome their unconscious biases. Sarah watched from the back of the room, accompanied by Chief Williams and representatives from 5 other major airports. The program had exceeded everyone's expectations, with Matthews proving to be an unexpectedly effective instructor. "Walking through that morning from my perspective," Matthews explained to the class, removing his own headset, "I thought I was doing my job, but I was actually letting my biases make decisions for me. Watch the scenario again, but this time, notice the other passengers I let through without question." A participant raised her hand. I've done the same thing, she admitted, sometimes without even realizing it. Matthews nodded. That's why we're here, not to feel guilty, but to do better. In the corner, Jenny was taking notes on her tablet. The program's success had already attracted attention from other industries. Hotels, restaurants, and retail chains were asking if the training could be adapted for their staff. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her development team. The next version of the training program would include artificial intelligence that could generate unlimited scenarios, making the training even more comprehensive. The key, Matthews continued, addressing his class, is understanding that security and respect aren't opposing forces. We can do our jobs effectively while treating everyone with dignity. During the lunch break, Sarah met with the airport administrators in the conference room. Charts on the screen showed the program's initial impact. Complaints about bias were down 60%, while positive feedback had increased significantly. Other airports are reporting similar results. Chief Williams said, pointing to the data, that what's really impressive is the change in staff morale. People feel better equipped to do their jobs. Matthews knocked on the conference room door, entering with his latest training report. He moved with a confidence that hadn't been there 3 months ago, not the false confidence of authority, but the real confidence that comes from growth and understanding. Ms. Johnson, he said, setting down his report, we had an interesting situation this morning. One of our officers recognized his own bias before it affected his actions. He said the training helped him catch himself in time. Sarah smiled. This was exactly what she had hoped for, not just avoiding incidents, but changing the way people thought about their interactions. The airport director turned to Sarah. We'd like to make this program mandatory for all U.S. airports. Would DataSmart be ready to scale up that quickly? Before Sarah could answer, her phone lit up with a news alert. A major airline had just announced they were adopting a modified version of the training program for all their ground staff and flight crews. We're already scaling up, Sarah replied. Our team has been preparing for this since day one. As the meeting continued, Sarah watched Matthews discussing training metrics with the airport director. 3 months ago, he had been a security guard letting his biases guide his actions. Now, he was helping others learn from his experience. Outside the conference room windows, planes took off and landed in the afternoon sun. Each one carried hundreds of people who would now experience a different kind of airport security, one based on respect, awareness, and understanding rather than assumptions and prejudice. Jenny poked her head into the conference room. Sarah, the governor's office called. They want to know if you'd be interested in helping develop similar training programs for state agencies. Sarah looked around the room at the people who had helped turn a moment of discrimination into a movement for change. Sometimes the biggest transformations started with the smallest moments and the willingness to learn from them. 6 months after the incident, the grand ballroom of the National Aviation Security Conference was packed with over 1,000 attendees. Security professionals, airport administrators, and industry leaders from across the country had gathered for the keynote speech. Chief Williams stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. When we talk about transforming security culture, we'd often think it requires massive policy changes or complex regulations. But sometimes, the biggest changes start with a single moment and the right response to it. Today's speakers will show you exactly what I mean. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing a simple blue dress. Next to her was Matthews, looking professional in his dark suit. On her other side sat her mother, who had flown in specially for this event. They were about to present the results of what had become known in the industry as the Johnson Protocol. Please welcome to the stage, Chief Williams announced, Ms. Sarah Johnson, CEO of DataSmart Solutions, and Mr. Derek Matthews, Head of Bias Training Implementation. The audience applauded as Sarah and Matthews walked to the stage. 6 months ago, they had stood on opposite sides of a terminal door. Now they stood side by side, ready to share their story. Matthews spoke first, his voice steady and clear. 6 months ago, I was the problem. Today, I'm part of the solution. He paused, looking out at the audience. And the difference between those 2 points is the power of choosing education over punishment. Sarah stepped up to the podium next. Behind her, a large screen displayed impressive statistics. Over 200 airports had adopted their training program. Bias-related complaints had dropped by 75% at participating locations. Staff satisfaction had improved by 60%. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sarah said, clicking to the next slide. It showed a photo of Matthews teaching a training session. Real change happens one person at a time, one moment at a time, one choice at a time. In the audience, airport directors nodded in agreement. Many of them had seen the results firsthand. The training program had expanded beyond its original scope, now being used by airlines, hotels, and even government agencies. Sarah's mother watched from her seat, tears in her eyes. She remembered all the times her daughter had faced discrimination, all the moments when anger would have been an easy response. But Sarah had chosen a different path, and that choice had created waves of positive change. Matthews took the microphone again. The most powerful moment in our training program isn't when people learn what they're doing wrong. It's when they understand how to do things right. He looked at Sarah. I learned that from Ms. Johnson. From the back of the room, Jenny signaled Sarah. Major news networks were covering the event. The hashtag Johnson Protocol was trending nationwide. But Sarah's focus remained on the human impact of their work. Today, Sarah continued, we're announcing the launch of the Johnson Matthews Foundation. This organization will provide bias training programs to public services free of charge, because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of who they are or where they're going. The audience rose in a standing ovation. In the crowd, Richard Chen, who had witnessed the original incident, smiled. He had just implemented the training program at his own tech company. After the presentation, Sarah and Matthews stood together at the reception. Airport administrators lined up to share their success stories. A young security officer approached Matthews, thanking him for his honesty in the training videos. A group of CEOs gathered around Sarah, eager to learn how to implement similar programs in their industries. Sarah's mother joined them, hugging Matthews warmly. Thank you, she said, for being brave enough to change. As the evening wound down, Sarah looked out the window at the planes taking off and landing at the nearby airport. Each flight carried people who would experience security differently now, with respect, understanding, and dignity. Chief Williams approached with news from Washington. The Federal Aviation Administration wants to make your training program a national standard, he announced. This could affect every airport in the country. Matthews turned to Sarah. Did you ever imagine this would happen when you walked into the terminal that morning? Sarah smiled, watching more people arrive for the evening session of the conference. No, she replied. But that's the thing about change. Sometimes the most powerful moments come from the most difficult situations. We just have to be brave enough to turn them into opportunities. The sun set outside the conference center windows, casting a warm glow across the room. What had started as a moment of prejudice had transformed into a movement of progress, proving that sometimes the best response to bias isn't outrage, it's education, understanding, and the courage to change.